Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya, and welcome to episode 135. On this week's episode of the podcast, I'm going to be reviewing another live-action Disney remake, this time with Snow White, minus we're not going to talk about that. It's just called Snow White. So there will be a non-spoiler section of the review, and there will be a spoiler section of the review. Time codes will be listed in the description, so if you have not had a chance yet to see the film, you will be able to hear my thoughts and not have the movie ruined for you. Although the movie is almost 100 years old, so if you haven't seen the cartoon, there's actually a fair amount that you won't know based on what has been added to the live-action version. I can't wait to get into it. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get into my non-spoiler thoughts for Snow White.
People are struggling, and it may not be much, but when I was young, my parents and we'd pick apples. We'd take them and make pies, then go out into the village.
Pies are luxuries. They don't need luxuries.
Already, I know that the sentiment around these live-action remakes is quite dire. The main question everyone asks when these started kind of rolling out more frequently was why. If you're just going to do the cartoons, we'll just watch the cartoons. And absolutely that is the case for a generation, if not two generations. And I would say for the most part, that has been mostly correct for Gen X's and millennials. But as we get into those younger generations, what I find most interesting is for a lot of people and then children, depending on what they've been exposed to in film and TV, these versions could likely be their first introduction. Does that necessarily mean it's a good thing? No, I'm going to argue no, because more often than not, and this shouldn't necessarily be shocking, the cartoons are better than the live-action remakes. There are very few of the live-action remakes that have justified their existence, where they change things for the better, or they take the bones of the cartoon and really build out something to stand on its own feet, metaphorically, of course. But I mean, there are characters with 2 feet. There are a lot of anthropomorphic creatures throughout all of these animated films that have now been remade. And what was especially interesting, in the height of these, they were all financially successful. A lot of them, not most, there was a substantial amount based on the Disney Renaissance period films, which if you're not necessarily familiar with that period, from The Little Mermaid in 1989 to 1999 with Tarzan, that's considered to be the Disney Renaissance period, which heavily, significantly saved the animated features from Disney and made it a viable part of the enterprise, because you had Broadway animated musicals, which were now being made for families, and you had The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King, and so on and so forth, and they were widely successful. Some of these live-action remakes have done that. Some have been successful regardless of critical reception, and I find it especially interesting because the ones that have been the most unique are the best films. They're the best reviewed films. But what I find particularly interesting in the realm of film criticism that we're in now, which is there are a lot of these features that just did the cartoon, and they're somewhat reviewed favorably, if not what some people have criticized as being padding in areas, fixing a continuity problem here or there, and they've been reviewed quite positively. There are some that have positive reviews that I think are a complete destruction or a bastardization of the animated classic. An example of that would be like Mulan to some degree, or even, Mufasa and the Lion King in general. Both of those fail to capture what works so well with that animated spectacle. And that's a realm where, if you've been following the Film Realist for a long time, you know that I'm somebody who's drawn to animation. That art form allows for you to do things that are impossible in live action. And this live action versions that have just been animals, if you include The Jungle Book, which had one human being in it. But that's one of the films that I prefer from the animated version, which, because of that, they managed to fix a through line and not make it feel like it's a bunch of short stories just kind of tacked onto each other, which is sort of the way that Rudyard Kipling had written The Jungle Book. It was just a bunch of adventures that Mowgli went on. Pete's Dragon is another example where you take Pete and a dragon and you completely change it, putting it in the woods and having that whole story be something much more personal than a weird fantasy where the only animated thing is the dragon. Of course, a lot of it was obviously in the real world as well. And some of them and I don't like using Rotten Tomatoes as a basis really to look at general film criticism, but of course the way that it compiles all positive reviews and then gives it in a nice, easy to understand algorithm, a lot of people tend to go to that website to look for positivity. And what I find so interesting with film criticism, and I started that and then kind of went off onto a tangent here, and apologies for that, is a lot of what works in Snow White is something that I personally feel fans of these animated films and critics in general have been asking for, which is being faithful to the original, but not being afraid to tell your own story. The ones that have been the best at this, Jungle Book, Pete's Dragon, Cinderella, Cruella, which was a massive shift, although obviously inspired by Maleficent, which was not positively reviewed, but still managed to have 2 films in that new rebooted version of the Sleeping Beauty franchise. Snow White does a lot of those things, and I can't get into that specifically in spoilers, but if you read my social media impressions after my screening and then the review that I posted on Letterboxd, I find it so funny because I've seen the cartoon. I think most people have of a certain age, but that movie is just barely 80 minutes long. There is a very simple story, and that character of Snow White, which in the 1930s is very limited in terms of her agency, and ultimately is just a victim saved by a man, which of course a lot of people wouldn't necessarily react to very positively in the filmmaking and creative arts landscape we live in now. Snow White, specifically Rachel Zegler's performance, blew me away. This shouldn't be shocking for anybody who's been following this actress's career. I mean, Shazam and the Fury of Gods, I'm not going to blame anybody in particular for that. But going from the West Side Story into Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, and then into Snow White, she has shown a versatility to her performances, and the characters that she has played have been so different from each other, allowing her the opportunity to show the range that she is capable of as a quite young actress. She's only 23 as I am recording right now. Happy birthday, May 3rd. Not that she's going to hear this. And Snow White's focus on Snow White, she is of course the titular character, is given all of the attention. And for that, she's brilliant in this. The whimsy, the magic, and the independence she is now given in this role just shines off of the screen. Her interactions with the main characters, the 7, they're called dwarfs in the movie. I am not using that word to talk about actual people. I am talking about the fictional magical people that are in this movie, that being the people who live in the cottage. And if you want to learn about the really messy production history of Snow White 2025, I recommend checking it out because it is especially interesting. And a lot of criticism that is being levied towards this film is of the performance of Gal Gadot. Obviously, there is a lot of politics happening in the world right now, and more often than not, actors are being asked to have opinions on what is going on. I don't want to get into any of that because it did not affect my opinion of the movie because I'm watching the movie for the movie. Put that on a t-shirt. Maybe that'll be the first official piece of Film Realist merch. I'm watching the movie for the movie. Quotes Kyle. And the performance in this is really interesting, and I'm not saying Gal Gadot has not been good in other films. I'm a diehard Fast and Furious fan. I also love the original Wonder Woman and saw a lot of positives in 1984. The movie as a whole doesn't really work, but I commend Patty Jenkins for what she was going for in this. What is telling in this performance, and you could tell me that this isn't the case, but I don't necessarily know if I wouldn't believe you. Mark Webb is a talented director. People would know him from the Amazing Spider-Man films and then 50, or if not 50, add another 0 to that, Kyle, 500 Days of Summer. And I would not be surprised if the choice to have her as the evil queen in this movie was a studio decision, because when this was supposed to come out in 2023 or 2023, I believe, would have been a great point of having her in the film. But now there's been a lot of negative reaction to Gal Gadot, her performances in things like Red One, obviously Wonder Woman 1984, and then her political opinions. But in the movie, she's clearly trying, but in terms of what works with Rachel Ziegler, which is the subtlety to the performance and knowing when to go big, and that being with the music, which I'll get into later, allows for Snow White to feel like a fully three-dimensional character. Gal Gadot as the evil queen, who doesn't even have a first name, she's just referred to as Queen and then the evil queen when she goes bad, shocker, is that she goes quite large in terms of the performance, a very grand, big performance. And in terms of, obviously, the movie is a magical fantasy, all the other performances outside of the seven dwarfs are not on that scale. This is a completely ridiculous comparison, but it kind of reminds me of like Elizabeth Berkley in Showgirls, which is most people know the movie they're in and they're not playing that as big as everybody else. But then obviously we know what happened with Elizabeth Berkley in that film. And I'm a big fan of Pasek and Paul's films, or the soundtracks that they've done. Dear Evan Hansen as a theatrical film did not work for me. I think it failed to miss what works so well about the Broadway musical. But a significant benefit to Snow White's limited runtime and it not being made in the era of animated Broadway musicals, Snow White is allotted to get all of the parts that we are so accustomed to in Disney films. We get the Dreaming of a Better World song from Snow White, as well as our two protagonists falling in love. There is an evil song in this that, of course, we are also all accustomed to. And then you get the classic songs from the animated film in this as well, with Hi Ho and Whistle While You Work. The blending of those two different aspects of the film with the more modern Disney filmmaking, which is hilarious to say that now, the more modern, it being essentially staples of their animated films of the 90s, which is 30 plus years old now, and then still painting over this with the live action version of the remake. I found this, in my opinion, to be one of the better remakes of this whole live action run, looking at the 20 films that they've done this with. Not even going to talk about the streaming films, but looking for a movie that is reminiscent and familiar to children growing up with this, you can see all those pieces. And I applaud everybody involved for choosing to focus the film on Snow White and changing key parts of it so that way this movie stands on its own. You can absolutely be overly critical, and that's what I'm going to say a lot of people have been, with this being cliche, or we've seen this before, or the independence is just to make it so it works in the modern era. Well, yeah, duh. That's the point of this movie. You are remaking it for a new generation. Interestingly enough, I took my kids to see this, and that's one of the films that just went overlooked on my part in showing them as they've been growing up. They obviously know the bones of it. Snow White eating the apple and the seven dwarfs are a part of childhood fantasy. You're aware of those tropes, given the film is nearly 100 years old. And including that in this, but still managing to craft something that is its own movie. This version, particularly Rachel Ziegler's performance as Snow White, is just as magical as Lily James in Cinderella or Emma Stone's Cruella. There have been so few versions of these live-action princesses or antagonists that really feel as if they've breathed new life into these characters, and that works for me. I'm going to get more into the dwarfs in the story spoiler section because there's a lot to talk about in there, but I really enjoyed this film. It is heartwarming. It is fun. Pasek and Paul wrote some brilliant songs that I've been listening to the soundtrack nonstop. My kids are addicted to it, and it is in line with what they've done with Dear Evan Hansen, The Greatest Showman, and now with Snow White. Of course, they also did Spirited in there as well. But I thought that this soundtrack really shows their strengths, and these are songs that are going to stand up with some of the newer songs that we've gotten from these live action remakes, that being Evermore in Beauty and the Beast and Speechless, which was written in Aladdin. I think that's a great addition to the pantheon of Disney songs. So that's my non-spoiler thoughts. Now I'm going to get into spoilers, all the major changes, so you can know what to expect when you go to see it. Let's jump into spoilers now.
Where is Snow White?
Snow who?
You're protecting her.
Answer, Her Majesty.
The first place I want to start is that the film has an extended prologue, which has a new song to set up essentially the world that we're living in. And I really appreciate that because it felt familiar to a lot of Disney films we've had in the past. We get to know the family, and people have criticized this trope, and yes, of course it's a part of it, but the reason it works is because it helps establish the characters' emotional states on where they are. We meet Snow White's family. The whole Snow White complexion thing has been completely changed. She was born during a snowstorm and thus named that because of when she was born. People are going to lose their minds about the DEI elements, but I'm not here for that whatsoever. I don't care. Rachel Zegler is a brilliant actress, and she crushes it as Snow White. And we see the way that the kingdom worked. It was fair and honorable, and resources were shared with everybody. Honestly, it's a very socialist kingdom. Obviously, you have royalty in there, and those things are kind of an oxymoron. But regardless, the kingdom run by the very kind king and queen, and raising Snow White to be an honorable and fair ruler when she eventually becomes the queen of Nameless Land. Of course, her mother passes away, likely got medieval cancer. We don't really know. And then the evil queen, who just shows up as a pretty lady, essentially woos the king and then gets her claws in and sends him off very Robin Hood, King Richard style. And then he either is dead or missing. But because of this, the queen steps in and starts being the evil queen. And she's Cinderella's Snow White, just makes her a maiden who has to clean the castle, and essentially looks like she has to do the same job all over and over and over again. And this gets the ball rolling where we meet a bandit, Jonathan in this instance, who is the leader of a group of bandits who are honoring the king and stealing from the rich to feed the poor. Again, very Robin Hoody, and I don't mind that. You're taking elements that are familiar parts of fantasy and then weaving them into this new take on Snow White. We have all the things we're familiar with, the evil queen, the apple, and now we can get into the dwarfs, which was the film's production originally included just the 7 bandits, who were a wide variety of different characters and ethnicities, and one character was a little person, and that leaked, and eventually they went into reshoots and then created CGI dwarfs who are all voiced by different people. I understand the criticism, I just hit my microphone, behind not using real little people actors. I completely understand. This was an opportunity to have 7 leads in this film, and I understand why that would upset people. This is not to say it is okay that they did that. Looking at the movie and its creation of the dwarfs, they are anatomically not remotely resembling that of real human beings. The inspiration is clearly taken from the animated character models of the 1938 film, where they are very, very short with very exaggerated heads and features on them to look cartoony. I don't know who did the visual effects for this movie, but it is astonishing that they remotely look real whatsoever. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Weta, but I'm not, oh no, it's Framestore. Regardless, they are hilarious. And talking about Rachel Zegler in the non-spoilers, her interactions with these characters is so charming and whimsical, and the back and forth, regardless of it being done through reshoots, and I'm sure you could probably figure out what was in the original production and filming and then what was added later. Obviously, everything with the dwarf side of it would have to be, but it doesn't feel stitched in a way where you're watching the movie going, oh my God, these feel like they were filmed in completely different years. Each performance of the dwarfs and the extended version of Hi-Ho allows their characters and their personalities to shine through. Doc is Doc, Bashful is Bashful, Dopey is Dopey, Grumpy is Grumpy, and so on and so forth. And I loved that where they don't just feel caricature-y or stereotypical. And more than anything, the relationship that they're allowed to have with each other is one of conflict. They don't really talk and communicate. And that being a part of where Snow White's coming from, which is the world in which the evil queen has created, has made it so that people are only looking after themselves. It's no longer this socialistic, fair, and honorable society. And this has also affected people who live beyond the city wall or the kingdom's walls, with where the dwarfs live in the cottage. And continuing that forward, where we have a storyline from Dopey, of course, a character, if you've seen the original, we are all familiar with, who is dumb and does not speak in the animated classic. And to have Snow White being that compassionate person and trying to see the best in everybody, and her focusing in on Dopey and seeing how his brothers or friends treat him, that part's not necessarily established, but I'm assuming they're all just friends because they all, I mean, I don't want to get into the beard thing. That doesn't really make any sense whatsoever. But the back and forth she has with him, the discussion on communication, and something she learned from her mother, and the whole concept of whistling, and the way that so perfectly blends into Whistle While You Work. And it was at that moment, I've seen the movie twice now. I went to my screening and then I took the family to see it. And the evolution of that scene, just seeing the one-on-one interaction between the two of them and the majestic nature, and it's just so fun. And you enjoy these characters bouncing off of each other. Some of that farcical slapstick humor that we're familiar with the dwarfs just oozes off the screen in this sequence where they're cleaning up the cottage. And having Dopey be this character whose confidence is coming from the fact that he's finally feeling like he could communicate with his friends. It's just so heartwarming to see that effectively communicated. And that shouldn't be shocking, regardless of the production nightmare that this film likely had. Mark Webb is a very capable filmmaker and really succeeds on one-to-one character interactions, regardless of the type of narrative that's trying to be told. 500 Days of Summer, there's been a lot of criticism about the perspective of that script, but then the interactions between Emma Stone and Andrew Garfield in the first film, obviously that's one of romance, but really establishing chemistry on screen and understanding how to do that effectively. And that continues here with Andrew Burnap, who I'm not familiar with whatsoever, but the chemistry built in with him and Snow White is just one of true attraction. And these two characters back and forth, conventional in there's misunderstandings. He meets her as a rogue, stealing from the castle, wanting to feed others. As I said earlier, very Robin Hood-y in design. But it would have been so conventional just have him to be a kingdom or a prince from another kingdom. And obviously we've gotten a sort of versions of that in other animated Disney fantasies, whether that be Cinderella, Aladdin, which of course Aladdin pretending to be Prince Ali, Abubu, Ababwa. But Jonathan being this rogue type, showing Snow White the world that people are truly living in because of what the evil queen has done, being this glutton, taking all of the food, all of the riches and the resources from the kingdom, and the effectiveness in which they deliver that, and showing how all the color has sapped away to almost this monochromatic world since she's taken over, and the fun with the rogue bandits and their chemistry with the dwarfs when we have the silly song of them all dancing. And I mentioned this in the non-spoiler section, but getting to have a love song or the duet that we are all very familiar with between the two characters really works. And the two characters sell their connection because they've had time to spend together. It's not one in which they've been forced to be together and you have to fall in love, or I saw you once and now we're in love, something that Frozen made fun of. but characters where they do spend time with each other and they see each other's points of view and it grows them as people, to the point where Jonathan risks his own life to save Snow White and sees that if they're honoring the king, which is what they've been doing while working in the forest, that they do need to go out and try to reclaim the kingdom with Snow White as the new fair ruler. I loved all that stuff. You can say a lot of it is conventional, and I will say you're right. However, none of this stuff was in the animated movie. We've been complaining for so long, 10 years now, because I would say almost 10 years, because Pete's Dragon is a really great adaptation where it's a brand new movie. But so many of these films have failed to really have their own identity apart from the animated movie. They've just been, look, it's the cartoon. Or it's gone in the complete end, which is, and I'm going to say Mulan is one of these movies where it just completely misunderstands Asian culture and fails to be its own thing because it sort of wants to remind you, but it doesn't want to be its own thing. There is a happy medium to be met in what they're attempting to do with these movies. Criticism could be levied against The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Lion King. Ironically, all of the films from the Disney Renaissance period that have been remade are just less interesting looking versions of the cartoons, where Snow White, being this movie that is so old, you have familiar imagery, but because you truly are making your own movie, regardless of it being with conventional things we're used to, they're not in the original. Snow White meets the dwarves, cleans up, eats the apple, dies, falls asleep, and then the dwarves run off the evil queen when she's all haggard, and then the prince shows up and kisses her to the end. It's a very simple story, but to give Snow White this level of agency and independence, and yes, the kiss is still here, but she is responsible for the conclusion of the movie. Not the dwarfs running off, which I did find relatively interesting because of the fact that that's maybe one of the most captivating animated parts of the original film, and it's not here in this one. To say that this movie is worse than some of the other ones, I find kind of laughable at this point, and to me it's very reminiscent of where we are with Marvel criticism. There's a lot of Marvel movies that I could understand people having issues with now, but there are some Marvel movies of the past that got a pass that I find laughable. Thor: The Dark World as a great example. Is that to say that no, this is not an incredible movie, but grading this on a scale compared to the other ones, this is certainly one of the better live action films where I'm much more compelled to watch this again than I would many of the other ones. At some point, it's probably going to come out this week. I don't have time to do it day of recording, but I'm going to be releasing my Disney remake tier list. So make sure you're following me on social media for that, because that will be coming out this week. I'm going to guess it's probably going to be Tuesday, but don't hold me to that if it comes out maybe a day later or so. So that you can look forward to that. Is Gal Gadot giving a performance that is not great? Yeah, I found it didn't work in the movie. The evil song just feels way bigger, and the inspiration behind what was likely its origin is interesting enough, and it's a part of the Disney structure to have an evil character song, and it's catchy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it works because of Gal Gadot's performance. Everything outside of Gal really did work for me in the movie. So if you're looking for something that feels familiar and still manages to be a new version of this story, Snow White succeeds. And I find it really funny that this one's getting levy all the criticism, some of which might have nothing to do with the actual movie itself. So those are my thoughts on the live action remake of Snow White. Now let's jump into listener, mail, and question of the week responses.
Can I ask you a question? Just one?
There's something I've been meaning to ask you.
I ask the questions, you answer the questions.
Why do you ask questions to which you already know the answers?
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it.
Last week's question of the week was, what is your favorite Disney live action remake? Jermaine Jones writes in Beauty and the Beast, closely to The Jungle Book. Film Realist listeners, you are welcomed. Now I respond to these questions, but rarely get put on the show, but I'm humble, so it's okay. Jermaine, I'm answering your reacting to your answer right here. So, buddy, thank you so much for submitting it. Stephanie writes in, I think my answer is Beauty and the Beast only because it was one of the first remakes. I mean, yeah, it's in that window when they were still slightly new. It was novel and it thrilled me that they got Alan Menken to do the music again, but with a flourish. What is the point of the Lilo and Stitch or How to Train Your Dragon remakes? They're going to be relying on animation for the main characters anyways. Yeah, those are especially interesting. Although, what's funny about something like Lilo and Stitch is it's an animated movie about a real place. And so some of the changes to that could be really interesting. And my hope is for that, because there has been such a substantial expansion of the Lilo and Stitch lore. There's Lilo and Stitch 2, Stitch the movie, Leroy and Stitch, and Lilo and Stitch the show that really expanded the kind of Jumba experiment 626 amount of creatures. And it turned into kind of this Pokemon thing. And then we had the hamster or gerbil bad guy. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. So there is a possibility of doing other things. How to Train Your Dragon makes no sense to me. I completely agree with you there. Scotty Cameron says, it might be the Jungle Book simply because Bill Murray singing Bare Necessities is fun, even though Baloo doesn't do all the fun stuff he does in the animated version. That's true, Scotty. Some of the slapstick from the cartoon is not in the live action, but there's definitely a lot more seriousness in terms of the drama, if that makes any sense, I think, in the original, or in the remake, which is why I think it's one of the better ones. Dylan writes in, Knives Out isn't Netflix, but Glass Onion is. That's definitely up there as far as Netflix original movies goes. Yeah, Glass Onion, I'm fairly certain, is what Keen was specifically talking about there. So I appreciate that, Dylan. And he goes, I don't think I've seen any of the live action remakes and don't have any interest in any of them. I will maybe see Lilo and Stitch, but they'll make me ask, who is this for? And that is a fair question, and I completely understand that. Crazy Maniac writes in Beauty and the Beast. I'm surprised with how many of these are Beauty and the Beast. I appreciate a lot of the additions to that, and I'm a huge Emma Watson fan. Her being Hermione and then Belle. One of the major criticisms, though, levied to that, and I think it's fair, is she is not a trained singer. So some of those songs just aren't going to be able to be on the level of Paige O'Hara, who was Belle in the animated film. That is something that I would understand. And then Keen Machine writes in, Greetings, Kyle. The best Disney remake, in my keen opinion, is the 101 Dalmatians of 1996. Not one that I think a lot of people talk about, which is interesting. Glenn Close was a phenomenal Cruella, Jolie Richardson, ATE as Anita, and it was my first intro to Hugh Laurie as an actor. That's right, he's Jasper in that. It's better than the animated film. There, I said it. Okay. And then Keen has a question for me. Controversially, what is a live-action film or series you'd love to see transformed into an animated work? Keep it Keen. I love this question, Keen, and I am locked and loaded, ready for my answer. If you know me well enough, or if you've been listening to the podcast enough, I don't think it comes up enough. I love Indiana Jones more than I love Star Wars, but to me, Harrison Ford is Indiana Jones more than he is Han Solo. We have had 5 feature films, 1 TV show. I am devastated by the fact that there is not a Clone Wars or a Rebels for Indiana Jones. We know in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull that he served with the British Secret Service during World War II. And with it being such a significant gap from Last Crusade to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it would be absolutely incredible to fill that time with a story of Indiana Jones's adventures, because that period where we didn't get a movie, which would likely have come out in the mid-90s, would have been amazing. So that's something I would love to see, to take the live action and to have a serial where you don't have to rely on the age of the actor to tell those stories. So that's something that I would absolutely love to see. Thank you to everybody who submitted your answers to Question of the Week. And as Keen did, you can always ask me a question. That's something I'm always looking forward to. This week's Question of the Week is interesting because it's a weird question, but given what next week's episode of the podcast is, I think this is a great time to ask this, which is next week's episode of the podcast is going to be a review of Reacher Season 3. So I'm really curious, what show, in your opinion, has had the best season 3? A lot of people might say that that's kind of where shows either really hit their stride or start kind of tumbling down in terms of quality. So that's what I would like to know. To submit your answers for Question of the Week, you can email the podcast, filmreelistspod@gmail.com, or you can comment directly on Spotify or YouTube, as well as adding Film Realist and making sure to include the hashtag QOTW. I look forward to your answers, and I will react to them on next week's episode. As I've said already, next week's episode of the podcast will be a review of Reacher Season 3, so you can look forward to that. If this is your first time listening and you haven't done it yet, please consider giving a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform, as well as dropping a follow on that platform. It helps the show grow, has those numbers increase, which will allow me more opportunities, such as what I now have access to, where I get to see a lot of the Disney projects early, which has been amazing because I personally feel that my analysis is only improved by getting to rewatch that content, television or movie, more than once, which I'm hoping leads to a better podcast episode. So if you would consider doing that, I would greatly appreciate it. My name is Kyle Naranya, and I will see you next time.